So in the first place, the Sans guardians are not in control of the Baha'i faith. They were able to take control over the material properties in the Holy Land. So it doesn't mean anything. It's irrelevant. The earth's a globe. The whole place is holy and sacred because it's the place where human beings live. That area of the world has a reputation for being the quote unquote holy land for very good reason, because the manifestations of God live their life and perform their mission in those areas. In the Bayan of the Bab, he declares that Tehran is the Holy Land. This is because Bahaullah was born there. This is what makes the earth holy and sacred, is that holy beings occupy it. And the cause of God is to evolve every human being from the mineral kingdom, the vegetable kingdom of growth and reproduction, we're made out of minerals, the animal body that we have, 2 eyes, 2 ears, nose, mouth, arms, and legs, into the spiritual kingdom of being a real human being, having the qualities and attributes of God that are latent within us, being able to shine forward. That's the future of the Baha'i faith. The Baha'i faith is in its golden age now. It's a spiritual golden reality of a clear understanding through transparency of exactly what the covenant and the teachings of the Baha'i faith is, and the fact that it's not a material cause, it's a spiritual cause. And this is what the nations need if and when they elect the Supreme Tribunal correctly, is that they will go there to become educated. It says they'll flow to the mountain of the house of the Lord and learn, war no more, that there's other ways for human beings to function. Instead of the struggle for survival, we have the cooperation for survival. But this is dependent upon the spiritualization of each individual human being. So when it says that our crusade, our one crusade, is against the insistent self, this doesn't mean we rush out with swords and guns and weapons or tactics and schemes and try to conquer the insistent self of other people or other groups or other doctrines and dogmas and creeds that they insist upon, so that we insist that they should stop doing that and then use force to force them to believe something contrary to their own understanding, forced conversion, to accept a name and then be obedient to a military government or army through force. This is the way the world has been working for 6,000 years, from 4000 BC to 2001, when the trade towers were struck. This is all wrong thinking. It's for the past. All needs to be removed. When he says the one crusade is against the insistent self, Abdulbaha is telling the Baha'i people that their job is to overcome their own insistent self. And the mechanism that Bahaullah and Abdulbaha gave for the people who are Bahais to do this is the covenant. They're supposed to accept the successor in each generation who's named in the covenant, so that they can receive their inheritance from the covenant, which is their spiritual reality. When a person's having this experience in God and they're consecrated to their spiritual reality and understanding in this way, they're not going to barter this away for all the money in the world. They're not going to, they're willing, in fact, the believers were willing to sacrifice themselves as martyrs rather than give up their faith. Well, this isn't some belief in a doctrine. The Baha'is' faith at the time of the Bab, they were absolutely loyal to the Bab. They were not going to separate themselves from his person. So they died rather than renounce him personally and God that he was revealing that at that time. The same thing during the ministry of Bahaullah. Firmness in the covenant meant that we accepted Bahaullah. Many of the Babis were not able to accept Bahaullah to be him whom God shall make manifest, until eventually the majority did accept it. Firmness in the covenant means loyalty is they were martyred during the ministry of Abdulbaha. They were loyal to the cause of God, and they were loyal to Abdulbaha himself. This is why Bahaullah says we swear fealty unto the ones who will arrive in the year Mustagath, in the gleanings. Mustagath adds up to 2001 AD, which is the end of the Adamic cycle. All the letters in the word Mustagath have numerical spiritual values that total 2001. And he prophesies this is the mirror of Al-Mustagath. And he sets the date, in other words, for the beginning of the golden age of the dispensation of Baha'u'llah at the year 2001 AD. And so the Baha'i faith has remained governed by the Baha'i government as explained in the covenant, and we're into the second epoch of the golden age of Baha'u'llah even now. But the people, if they don't have their third eye open, cannot visualize the spiritual reality of this. If they're only looking with their material eyes, they just look to see who is in control of Mecca, who is in control of the Temple Mount, who is in control of Mount Carmel and Baji. They just look with the outer material eye of who's in possession of these things. And these things they've misconstrued as power. They're in fact, they're the essence of weakness and the absolute abomination of having any worldly desire for material conquest in this plane of existence at all. So the future of the Baha'i faith is that what's taking place now, that the majority of people who are Baha'is are not being spiritually fed, and they're misled in the group that has a false leadership that cannot show any connection to the book of the covenant of the Kitabiyan and the Will and Testament for Baha'i affairs. So of course, in the Baha'i world, we have our own form of Baha'i government and administration, the covenant and administration, by which we can keep a unity and a coordination, a cooperation for Baha'i affairs in our local and national Baha'i communities throughout the world. And we have a school. All of the Baha'is under the covenant and the people that come to the school learn about the one crusade being against the insistent self. And when they figure this out, they become very happy and detached, and they taste everlasting life in eternal paradise right now, the same as they will after their bodies go back in the ground at the end of their days. And this attracts other people to this. They want to know, what is it that these people have that gives them this outlook, this spiritual outlook, and this spiritual energy, and this spiritual sustenance. And then they become attracted, consecrated, or converted and consecrated unto God as well. This is the foundation of the faith. The spiritual transformation of the individual Baha'is doing their inner temple work themselves, and the mechanism of the covenant is what makes this happen. When Mirza Yahya says he's not going to accept Baha'u'llah and he's going to set up another sect of Babism in opposition to he whom God shall make manifest, this is coming from Mirza Yahya's insistent self. So he's failing right at the beginning. And those who remained with him were failing also. When Muhammad Ali and the Bahais, all of them, rejected Abdulbaha, Abdulbaha was alone. He just had his uncle and his wife and his children, and that was it. Maybe you could count the number of believers on one hand. You might have had 5 supporters. And Muhammad Ali in 1892 had convinced all the people to reject Abdulbaha. It wasn't until about 1900, after they were finally exposed in 1896, that through the love of Abdulbaha, the majority of the Baha'is started to come back and accept Abdulbaha. And so what happens is, because we have an evil inclination toward the insistent self, which is our animal self, we become tested, and we have to make choices. For the Baha'is, this becomes a personality test. For instance, why did the people reject Baha'u'llah to be him whom God shall make manifest? If we use our intellect, our third eye, we can see that Baha'u'llah fulfills the criteria legally. He fulfills the prophecies of the Bab for appearing in the year 9, being him whom God shall make manifest, and as having the mission to reveal the blueprint for the coming of the kingdom of God on earth. And he came at the prophesied date. We mentioned the year 9, and he was in the prophesied address in Tehran and Baghdad, according to those prophecies of the East. Baha'u'llah also fulfills prophecies from the Bible. Jesus said, "Whosoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man," so he's the Son of a Man, "be ashamed when he comes in Baha'u'llah, the glory of the Father." It says that in Isaiah that the glory of God will be on Mount Carmel. And then in Hosea, it says Akka will be a door of hope. So it'll be in Mount Carmel and Akka. It states that upon the throne of David and over his kingdom, to uphold it and establish it from this time forth and forevermore, the zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. Baha'u'llah is a descendant of King David. He's that descendant of King David that all of his ancestors sat upon the throne of David. So he fulfills that prophecy. And then in the book of Daniel, it says there'll be 2,300 evenings and mornings, which are years. We add that to the starting point that's indicated at 457 BC edict to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. We get 1844 AD, and then it gives the years 1260 and 1290 and 1335 in Daniel. 1260 is the Bab's date of 1844 from calendar to calendar. 1290 from the proclamation of Muhammad to the proclamation of Baha'u'llah is 1863, and 1335 from victory to victory is from 628 AD to 1963, when the Shoghi Effendi knew this promised one would arrive that would be the establisher of the Baha'i faith. And it all happened. So we see that God is completely in control of Baha'i affairs, that God himself is the government for Baha'i affairs and guidance through the covenant administration. So the test of the insistent self is the personality. There's no reason to reject Baha'u'llah when we can look and see with our intellect that he fulfills the criteria by the prophesied name, the prophesied date, the prophesied address, and the prophesied mission of the promised one. So when Mirza Yahya and other people rejected Baha'u'llah, this was because of their own insistent self, that they put their own personality above the revelation that God gave, that we have to use our intellect to recognize. And they tried to swerve and derail other people from using their intellect to see if the criteria is fulfilled. And this is what's been happening in the Baha'i faith. Every time there's a changing of the guard, so to speak, from Baha'u'llah to abdulbaha, from abdulbaha to Shoghi Effendi, this is a test. It's a test that provokes or challenges the insistent self. And it becomes the day of great dividing and the day of judgment and the day of decision for the Baha'is, whether they're going to accept or reject the next successor that's named, the next appointed successor. And when this happens, the group separates. Some people leave, others remain firm in the covenant, and some people get confused if there's an argument over this. So when Shoghi Effendi passed on, right before he did, there were only 3 members left in the Holy Family, or the family of the appointed successorship, that is the household of the covenant. And this was Shoghi Effendi, Abdul-Baha's son, Mason Rimi Agsan, and Shoghi Effendi's wife, Ria Khanum. And Shoghi Effendi was a natural member of the family of the covenant, and Ria Khanum and Mason Rimi were members of the Holy Family of the Covenant by law. She was the daughter-in-law of the family of the Covenant when she married Shoghi Effendi, and Abdul-Baha in 1900 adopted Mason Rimi to be his son, and he was legally part of the Holy Family and spiritually so. During those 20 years, he served his father, Abdul-Baha, faithfully. So when Shoghi Effendi passed on, the 2 members of the Holy Family that were left alive in the world were members of the family of the covenant by law. In the same way, Mirza Yahya had it in with Bahaullah, and Muhammad Ali had it with abdulbaha, and all of Shoghi Effendi's family, including his parents, had a disagreement with him. We know that Mirza Yahya, Muhammad Ali, and Shoghi Effendi's family were wrong. The reason we know this is when we use our intellect, we can see that Baha'u'llah in the Book of the Covenant appointed Abdul-Baha to be his legal successor. So anybody who's opposing Abdul-Baha is in the wrong, even if it's Muhammad Ali. When Abdul-Baha wrote the Will and Testament and he showed that Shoghi Effendi replaces Muhammad Ali as the second individual successor, we can read the Will and Testament with our intellect and see that the covenant is continued in Shoghi Effendi. It doesn't matter what his personality is. It's going to be a personality that's different than ours. And that's going to be a challenge to anybody. And this is the test of God. When Jesus showed up in Jerusalem, he was a different person than Caiaphas and Ananias. Muhammad was different personality than Abu Sufyan. They ran him out of town. These people refuse to use their intellect to recognize the criteria that God has given so that the people can recognize the messenger or the representative or the servant or the one that God has purposed for that generation. And it's a test against their personal ego. That's all this is. And that's why the covenant works this way, because the entire cause of God is a crusade against the insistent self. And there's no better way to provide for an educational opportunity to overcome the insistent self than for the selves of people to have to recognize someone else other than themselves in the appointed role of the appointed successors of the covenant. So when they reject the appointed successor, they already can't overcome the insistent self. I mean, as far as claiming to be Bahais at the same time, they need to be able to accept a person with a personality, a real human being that has faults, flaws, and problems that's just as much a human being as anybody else. And this is the way God operates. Baha'u'llah himself, according to Abdul-Baha and Some Answered Questions, is a human being. He starts out Some Answered Questions by saying we have the need for an educator, and then states that Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, the Buddha, the Bab, Baha'u'llah, they are human beings. So they're just human beings, just like us. And that's the test, because we're supposed to treat each other humanely as real human beings. And we don't treat the manifestations of God humanely. We crucify them. We banish them out of town and put them in prison. We take their families away from them. We separate them from their friends. If we find out who their friends and followers are, we kill them along with the manifestations. We banish them into exile and crucify them, and so forth and so on. When the manifestation of God is the perfect human being. Now, when you meet the manifestation of God, there's still a person, but this is the perfect person. In other words, a person can't become more perfect than that. They still get sick, they get old, they get diseases, they get hungry, they get tired and go to sleep. People might not like the way they comb their hair. They might not like the clothes that they wear or the language that they speak or their sense of humor or aspects like this. These are all the same types of problems that happen amongst people in general, especially when they have the material mindset of conquering the world or conquering and dominating other people in their life and in their relationships around them due to insecurities and this problem with the insistent self and the blaming self vicious cycle that they get stuck in. We need an educator. So when Shoghi Effendi was passed on, there are only two members of the Holy Family of the Covenant still around, Ruia Khanum and Mason Remy. Well, the majority of the people were led to believe that Mason Remy was in the wrong and Ruia Khanum and the Hands were in the right. So because of this belief and because it's religious, if somebody's going against the religion, well, then they just hate these people. So they like hate Mirza Yahya. They hate Muhammad Ali, those violators. They hate Mason Remy, that covenant breaker. And this is the insistent self again. Bahaullah states in the Octus that if Mirza Yahya were to repent, he'd be welcomed back into the community. And Abdulbaha didn't want to see Muhammad Ali speeding toward destruction. It was his brother. He loved him. Bahaullah raised Mirza Yahya like he was his own son. He was one of his younger siblings, and after his father died, he was obligated to be responsible for raising him. But he had personal problems and struggles overcoming his own insistent self. So when Muhammad Isfahani got involved, he was able to tempt and test Mirza Yahya and bring out his insecurity problems and support him to oppose Bahaullah. And Yahya was addicted to his behavior pattern because of his inferiority, superiority complexes and other personal things. So we don't hate Mirza Yahya. I mean, there but the grace of God go I, we should think. But Jesus says we should love our enemy. So we don't hate people that fall away. It's tragic. Seeing the spiritual catastrophe upon an actual person that thinks they're saved and right and holy, as Mirza Yahya did, claiming to be the Bab's successor, and dedicating his life to be in the opposition against Bahaullah, as we see with our intellect that Bahaullah fulfills the criteria. Definitely Mirza Yahya is the enemy of Baha'u'llah's work, and Jesus says, love your enemy. And the covenant says to avoid their company and to shun and avoid their schemes and machinations. And modern psychology tells us this. It tells us that we should stay away from toxic behavior and toxic patterns of toxic people. The cause of God in teaching the Baha'i faith means to attract people out of the toxicity and toward what's healthful and healthy for them and functional. And then they should be converted away from toxic toward health and spirituality. And then they should become consecrated to the program, working the program to continue to teach the cause. Once they've overcome this toxicity in their own self, they can help other people learn to figure out and adjust and be guided to how they can do this for themselves also. This is the work of what it means to be a real human being. We're here on earth to experience and grow spiritually. That's our purpose. And when we're fulfilling our spiritual purpose, we find a spiritual happiness that cannot be rivaled or described. So because they believed, without using their intellect, that Mason Remy broke the unity of the hands, and they think unity is the covenant, therefore he's the enemy, and they're in the situation they're in now. Well, in the Will and Testament, it states that with divine unity as their excuse, they will deprive themselves and perturb and poison others. And that's what happened. Ruia Khanum deprived herself when she broke the covenant and separated from the person who fulfills the criteria in the covenant. We can see that Abdulbaha fulfills the criteria in the covenant. We can see that Showqi Effendi fulfills the appointed criteria for the appointed successor in the covenant. When we look at what happened after Showqi Effendi passed on, the hands fulfill no criteria at all in the covenant whatsoever. In the writings of Abdulbaha, he states that when the guardian dies, the hands inherit nothing. They're the inheritors of nothing. They're the hands of the living guardian. When the guardian dies, his hands die with him. When I die, my hands here on my body are going to die with me. When Showqi Effendi died, all of those people died as hands, and they were no longer actually hands of the cause of God, because the covenant says the hands are under the direction of the living guardian. So without a living guardian, whose they were the hands of, they're no longer hands at all. So there's no support for the hands having any authority in the covenant. Many books have been written on this over the last 60 years. by many different Baha'i groups and Baha'i people, showing that the hands are in violation of the covenant. Nowhere in the Will and Testament does it state that Ruia Kanum fulfills the criteria for the appointed successor in the Will and Testament. It's absolutely non-existent. When we look back at the history of this, we see that Charles Mason Remy Ogson is the legally adopted son of Abdulbaha, therefore he's an Ogson. In Star of the West magazine, there's many letters published from Abdulbaha addressed to his son, Mason Ogson, that starts out with, "My dear son, oh my beloved son of the kingdom, oh my son." And he didn't speak English, Abdulbaha, he spoke Arabic and Persian. And the way he said son in that language was Gusan, or branch, or Ogson. So this is something that's a fact. Shoghi Effendi in 1922, when he translated the Will and Testament into English, invited Abdul-Baha's son Mason to the Holy Land, and he was the first person that Shoghi Effendi shared the English translation of the Will and Testament to. And he gave Mason Remy a token of his inheritance, locks of Baha'u'llah's hair and drops of his all-sacred blood, the hair representing the headship of the Universal House of Justice, and the blood representing the bloodline of King David that Mason Remy inherited through his legally adoptive father, Abdul-Baha. Shoghi Effendi welcomed Mason Remy, Abdul-Baha's son, as the president of the First International Baha'i Council on January 9th of 1951. In the Israeli State Yearbook, Mason Remy is listed as the president and head of the First International Baha'i Council in the Israeli State Yearbook from 1951, 52, 53, 54, 55, 56, and 57. And in 57, with the passing of Shoghi Effendi, Mason Remy is listed as the head of the Baha'i faith, as the president of the International Baha'i Council in the Israeli State Yearbook. Mason Remy met with the hands after the passing of Shoghi Effendi, and they refused to have an IBC UHJ meeting with him. They weren't going to do this. They were already following Ruia Kanum, and this has been described by Mason Remy in his daily observations that I hope everybody would at some point would get a chance to peruse through, if not read, interestingly. And he talks about how these personality tests of the insistent self eroded the whole group. So Mason Remy, as the president of the Universal House of Justice, the First International Baha'i Council, the IBC-UHJ, he made an agreement with these hands. He could see that they were in trouble, and they signed a contract, and they all put their name on it. And what it said is the hands promised they would not interfere with the 10-year plan of Shoghi Effendi from 1953 to 1963 for that International Baha'i Council to become an officially recognized Baha'i court by the government of the State of Israel. The same way in 1962, the State of Israel passed the Druze Courts Law for the Druze people. They would have passed a Baha'i Courts Law in 1963, and the International Baha'i Council, with Mason Remy as the president, would have been officially recognized as the Baha'i World Court by the government of the State of Israel. And the 5 national spiritual assemblies in the Islamic countries of the East would have been transformed into 5 national Baha'i courts, with the International Baha'i Court, the UHJ, with Mason presiding, Abdul-Baha's son, would have been the final appellate court. So when 1959 was coming along and they were going to have the Baha'i Courts Law put into motion, the hands realized that if the State of Israel accepted the International Baha'i Council, the IBC-UHJ, with the appointed membership, they'd already published in their yearbook that, that Mason Remy was the head of the whole thing, that they had to do away with this. So instead, the hands met as a conclave of hands to decide all these things. And that's how all this trouble has come down upon the people. When we look back at this and see when they started to dismantle and break their agreement that they signed with Mason Remy in 1957, that they would not interfere with the Baha'i Courts Law acceptance of the IBC-UHJ by the State of Israel, that's when Mason Remy made his proclamation. And in his proclamation in 1960, which he sent out to all the Baha'i world during Rizwan, he stated that as he was the president of the First International Baha'i Council, the hands had no right to dismantle it or to go against the evolution of Shoghi Effendi's four-stage constitution, in other words, in the 10-year plan. So the hands turned around and said Mason Remy was a covenant breaker. But they're the ones who broke the covenant with him when they said they wouldn't interfere with the International Council. And they're lucky he even made that agreement with them and signed it, because they were already in violation because of the Will and Testament. Because the Will and Testament states that we should all turn to the center of the cause of God, Shoghi Effendi. This is the last verse of the Will and Testament on page 25 and 26. And then after him, the universal house of justice. And he who turns unto whatsoever else is in grievous error. So at the moment Shoghi Effendi died in London, when they failed to have an IBC-UHJ meeting immediately, and instead Ria Khanum had them turn to her in the hands, they fell into grievous error. Yet Mason Remy wanted to save them. So he remained with them for 3 years, and he entered into another contract with them that stated that they would not interfere with the IBC-UHJ, which he was the president of. The reason he did this is if they would have stuck with that, he figured they would come back and accept the Universal House of Justice that was already in existence. But instead, in 1959, they called for the abandonment of this IBC-UHJ and the election of a new one without a guardian as the president in 1963. So in order to protect the covenant as the guardian, the president of the first IBC-UHJ, Mason Remy sent out his proclamation declaring that he's the president of the First International Baha'i Council. So they said he's a covenant breaker. He is the president of the First International Baha'i Council. How absurd. It says so in the Israeli State Yearbook for 7 years, and Shoghi Effendi appointed him, and it's in the Baha'i literature, and it's in Shoghi Effendi's cablegrams, and he's Abdulbaha's son. He's an Agsan. And it says if the guardian doesn't have his own son, he should choose another branch or Agsan to succeed him. So Mason Remy is, when we look back 60 years, we can see that he does, through the intellect, fulfill the criteria of the appointed successors in the covenant. Now, the other successors in the covenant are not appointed, but they're equal. They're just as equal a successor as the appointed successor. And these are the chosen successors. These are the ones who choose to accept the appointed successor in their day and thus pass the test of personality and receive their inheritance in the covenant. And when the majority of people of the world come under this, we will elect the Universal House of Justice correctly. The nations of the world have done the same thing. They've elected the imitation of the Supreme Tribunal incorrectly. So it failed to uphold the International 1928 Covenant of Peace. World Court failed, League failed, and the UN is failing now. And of course, we had World War II and all these other wars during the time of the UN because it never prevented any war. It made war illegal, and it came up with a way they could settle their disputes, but it was rigged. And it's atheistic because the Russians were communists at the time, and it's not fully representative of the other nations. And because of the arms race, we have nations that are scared of this big bully that has nuclear weapons that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II. So we're in a flight and fright situation where the people are traumatized by this existential threat of total thermonuclear global annihilation or other weapons of mass destruction. And they're worried that the United States and the West has declared that some of these countries that they say won't cooperate are, evil and should be destroyed and wiped out and so forth. And so the people in the religions like the Muslims and the Jews and the Christians, they seem to think the Baha'i faith has the same evil spirit behind it of conquest and empire building and so forth. Well, this whole mentality is the challenge against the insistent self. And this current crisis in the Ukraine, in my estimation, will result in the majority of all the people of the world fully overcoming their insistent self, to the extent that we can uphold the international 1928 Covenant of Peace correctly, and have a supreme tribunal elected, a Council of the Nations, that will settle disputes and eliminate the need for war in all of its forms. So this test is a test of whether people are going to use their intellect and go by the criteria or not. So the main group followed Ria Kanum in the hands. And today they have no connection to the appointed successors of the Holy Family of the Covenant. They say that when Ria Kanum passed on, they no longer have any connection to the Holy Family of the Covenant at all. Then they say they have no guardian, and therefore only the guardian can appoint hands, so they have no hands of the cause anymore. So they've mutilated the Baha'i faith completely. Showqi افندی says, separated from the institution of the guardianship, divorced from the institution of the guardianship, the Baha'i faith would be mutilated. The institution of the guardianship is an institution of the appointed successors of the covenant to test the people in the community on a visceral, personal level, to assist them to overcome their insistent self. They're lacking this mechanism. Therefore, they're not the Baha'i faith, and they can't do anything, even if they self-identify as Baha'i. Because what we mean by the Baha'i faith, we mean faith that this appointed successor in the covenant is going to continue ad infinitum. So we, the chosen successors of the covenant, who choose to accept the actual successors, can grow and evolve and fulfill the missions that God has endowed us with. That's how this works. So today we're in the 5th generation of the holy household of the covenant. We have bahaullah, abdulbaha, Abdul-Baha's son, his grandson, and his great-grandson, 5. So we're in the 5th generation right now, and the second epoch of the golden age of the dispensation of Baha'u'llah that began in the year Mustagath, which is the year he prophesied that the golden age of the dispensation would begin. These people are going to be in what they think is the formative age for eternity. Because they separated themselves from the appointed successors of the covenant in this way. So you can see what the problem is. Now, this was meant to be, that they have demonized Abdul-Baha's son, Mason Agsan, to such an extent that people can't even use their intellect. This is a tactic. When people are emotionally threatened or threatened with existential crisis, like you're going to go to hell and burn or something, they can't think straight. This is the problem with religion. This is why in the Quran it says there's no compulsion in religion. And Thomas Jefferson, who had a Quran, the United States made the First Amendment, freedom of religion because of this. So there's no compulsion in religion. So the Baha'i system that we have here, looking back 60 years from now, we can see that with our intellect that only Mason Remy fulfills the criteria as the appointed successor. And that was the true universal house of justice. And it still is right now. And we're in the 5th generation of succession in this. So we're still at the early stage. This would kind of be the 5th generation from Muhammad, as I think Jafar al-Sadiq. He's the 6th Imam, but he's the 5th through lineage, through Hussein, because Hassan didn't have a successor Imam. It went to his brother after that. So it's a similar thing. Now, the 4 Sunni schools that exist, that are accepted by the mainstream, were founded. The 4 founders of the 4 Sunni schools were 4 students of the founder of the faith, Jafar al-Sadiq. And he's the founder of Ithna Ashari. So Jafar al-Sadiq is the human being who had his own personality, that's the founder of all of Islam, both the 4 Sunni schools and the Shiite school. So if we go back to the teachings of Jafar al-Sadiq, why would the imam who be promoting the Sunni schools? So this is what I'm saying. We're not in opposition to any of the different Baha'i schools that have been set up. In Greek, the way you say school is a heresy. In fact, we have many schools of thought and many individual thoughts. The power of the covenant is to allow for different schools of thought by having a unity in a human being. So the unity the Bahais have is a community. The Bahais of Baha'u'llah's generation were with Baha'u'llah. Then they were with abdulbaha. Then they were with Showqi افندی. Then in their community, like it says in the Nowruz prayer, where we break our fast with the man whose name is the branch amongst us. This was Abdul-Baha's son was a member of the community. Then his grandson, and now his great-grandson, and so on and so on and so on for the 5,000 century Baha'i cycle. So this main group now finds themselves bereft and separated from the family of the covenant, the same way the Sunnis found themselves separated from Jafar al-Sadiq and the other imams. And because it's a school, and we go from first grade to second grade to third grade, or history 101 at college to 201 to 301 to 425. When we graduate, we have different levels of grades there. And when we go from grade to grade or from class to class, there's a different teacher in the different classes and a different teacher in the different classes of the different grades. If you're not in the presence of the teacher, you're not in the classroom. If you're not aware of the teacher and you're there with them during the classroom hour, you're not learning the lesson. You're playing hooky and you've dropped out of school and you only still have third grade knowledge by refusing to accept the fourth and fifth and sixth grade education. That's what this is. It's not a material government. It's the administration of the government, in other words, of the college. Every university has its own president and administration and faculty and student body. That's what this is. And if you go to a university campus, the government that's running the campus smoothly, serving the needs of the students, is loved by the students. They love the university. They love the administration. They love the student body and that they're a member of, and they love the faculty and all the people in the administration. That's what this is. It's just a school. There's no army, there's no weapons, but there's tests. And these tests happen regularly for the spiritual evolution of the people. When they separated themselves from the appointed successor of the Holy Family of the Covenant, they deprived themselves individually of being members of the holy household. That's what the Baha'i faith is. We're all considered members of one household. Well, we can't be members of one household if we reject the center of the point of unity in the appointed successors of the covenant. That is the sign of God to indicate the core of the holy household of all of mankind. So when they separated from this, they fell back into Nafsamara and the insistent self. And the things that they're doing are completely ineffectual, and they know it. And they're miserable in this condition, especially now that things have gotten to the pitch that they have. The same week that Abdul-Baha's shrine burned down on the holy day of Friday was the week of April 7th and 8th and 9th, that week. This was the week the Russians pulled out of Kiev, and when the Ukrainian people went back into the town, unearthed mass graves, and Russia was declared to be in violation of human rights and was removed for the first time since World War II. A major power was removed from the Human Rights Council in Geneva out of the United Nations, or The Hague at the World Court, that wherever they meet to do the Human Rights Council things. And when at the same time when this happened, the next day Abdul-Baha's shrine caught on fire. Some people have been talking about cover up for embezzlement in funds that was mentioned to us a few weeks ago. We weren't aware of that till then. I don't know what the reality behind that is, but in other words, they're not being spiritually guided or spiritually fed. So the test is accepting the appointed successor in our generation. All right, so what does that mean? Well, on the religious side, we have divine unity, and this is a spiritual reality which cannot be expressed in words. Our watchword is unity in diversity. Once people sober up and realize what generation they're in and who this appointed successor is in their generation, we're all equal. Abdulbaha stated in his day that all the believers were equal with him. He has a vote of one, and he's a person, and he's a human being. He has his own true genius and his own function in the covenant, but when it comes to being a human being and a servant of God, we're all equal in this way. So the presidents of the Universal House of Justice in the Bahai government of the Bahai world itself, not the government for the nations, but the government and administration of our school, only has a vote of one. And what was happening is that bahaullah wants to eradicate autocracy and the rulership of one person. So when it comes to religion, we don't have people lording it over us what religious and spiritual truth is. Instead, we've agreed, since God is unknowable in essence and our soul is unknowable in essence, that we, through the power of the covenant, we have this divine unity through which we receive our rays of the Holy Spirit, both the chosen successors who choose to accept the succession and the appointed successors who are purposed by God in this day. So God is going to pick a person that has a whole complex of issues that is perfectly fitted for the problems to be ameliorated of the generation that they're the appointed successor of. The things that they do that are beneficial will help promote the growth and functioning of cooperation amongst the people. And the things that they do that are just from their own selves levels the playing field where we're all equal with a vote of one and have a true community. And this is what's lacking when we have an usurper. When an usurper who's not fulfilled the criteria we can recognize by our intellect to be an Agsan and be appointed by the previous one would come there, they've come to that position through the use of their insistent self. See the problem? So because Kanum and the Hands did what they did and then elected a so-called UHJ in 1963, the spirit behind that was the spirit of the insistent self. The insistent self of Kanum, who insisted on not having a Universal House of Justice meeting with Abdulbaha's son chairing the council discussion. See, they were against this because they think this is power and authority and stuff from like this materialistic mindset and other personal reasons of their own that come between them and God. So because what they did is motivated by the insistent self, everybody who becomes part of that community is subject to be infected by the insistent self that's coming from the top down. This is why in some answered questions in the chapter on conferred infallibility or the supreme sinlessness, he explains that God guides certain people and leadership position so they won't fall into error. He says if they fall into error, then the other people will fall into error also. So what he's given us so we won't fall into error is the covenant where we can recognize the center of the cause, the guardian, and after Shoghi Effendi's passing, the Universal House of Justice, head and body both. When we say Universal House of Justice, we mean it's got a guardian as the president or a descendant of King David that chairs the meetings. So now the majority of Baha'is find themselves out in the cold. They've been abandoned by the Hands who misled them and then died and abandoned them. They have no connection to the appointed successors of the covenant and to the Holy Family. And the book is worthless without the Holy Family. All the religions testify to this. All the Jews at the time of the rabbis in about 800 AD separated themselves from the family of King David and created rabbinical Judaism, the rabbinate versus the exilarchate, the exilarchs being the exiled monarchs of King David that they separated from. So today the Jews have their book, they don't have the family of David. The Christians have their book, they have no connection to the family of David and Jesus in any way. In fact, the Romans murdered all the male descendants of collateral descendants of Jesus, the Desposini. So the Muslims are not connected to the family, the Ahlul Bayt in any way, neither Sunni nor Shiite, since the passing of Hassan al-Askari, the prisoner, and the vanishing and expected appearance of the 12th Imam. And the Sans Guardian Bahais are the same way. And this is prophesied of in the Quran. In the Quran, Abraham says, I would like to have confidence of heart through direct perception of the reality of the resurrection, he says to God. So God says, take these four birds and kill them. So he chopped these four birds up into pieces and scatters them everywhere. And then he says, now say this and call them forward. And he calls them forward, and the four birds have resurrected from the dead. Well, in the Quran, it says Muhammad's uncle Hamza was resurrected from the dead. He was in a battle, and the enemy saw him, and they never saw him physically die or physically resurrect. So they questioned Muhammad, and this is all recorded in the Quran. How is it that Hamza's resurrected from the dead? Well, it's a spiritual resurrection, not a physical, material, fleshy resurrection. Jesus said, let the dead bury the dead. He didn't mean other dead people would come out of the grave and bury another dead man. He meant that those that didn't believe on him while he was alive in the flesh were spiritually dead. This is what he means. So this is continued in the what true religion is. True religion is that in every generation, there's a point of unity who's an appointed designee, so that the believers of God, the one true invisible God, can recognize this succession for their generation and become the chosen people who've chosen to accept this. That's the test. So this test is continued in the Baha'i faith, in the institution of the appointed successorship of the guardianship, which it's also stated is the irremovable head and sacred head and member for life of the IBC-UHJ. So it's very clear. So when we use our intellect and look back at what happened in the day of great dividing in 1960, there's no doubt that the hands were wrong. Now, and the result is the people are permanently separated from the family again. And this is the family of Abraham. He had three wives, Sarah, Keturah, and Hagar. From Hagar comes Muhammad and the Bab. From Keturah comes Buddha, Krishna, and Zoroaster. And from Sarah comes Bahaullah and Jesus and Moses. And Bahaullah is also descended from Keturah in the female line from Zoroaster. So in the male line from Sarah and David, from the female line through Keturah and Zoroaster. It's the holy family, the Ahlul Bayt of Abraham, who had Isaac and Ishmael, from which come Judaism and Christianity and Islam, three of the birds. And the fourth bird is the Baha'i faith, the bird being a symbol of the Holy Spirit. And when it becomes corrupt, it can take on the connotation of the evil birds mentioned by Rumi and Baha'u'llah in the seven valleys of the duck, the crow, and the rooster and the peacock. But these four birds also represent, without a doubt, inwardly, aside from the birds of that I mentioned of Rumi for personal growth and evolution, they represent the four Abrahamic faiths of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and Baha'i. All four of these indicate the throne line of King David continuing. In the Quran, it's King David and Solomon are the caliphate, the universal caliph of God. Now, the imamate was the religious successor, but the caliphate was King David, and the descendant of David was amongst the companions of the prophet during his lifetime, the exilarch Bastani. And this is what is significant to this. In Judaism, the religion was governed by the high priest, and the Davidic kings were there also. In Christianity, Jesus appointed his apostles as a council to govern the religion, and the Christians of Jesus' day were well aware of the exilarch Eliuni that Peter went and met in Babylon. That was at the schools where the Talmud was compiled after Peter's visit there. So the Bahais are the same way. They have no connection to the family of David, continuing through Bahaullah and abdulbaha, the mainstream ones, till now. So these four birds are dead. And the scattering into little pieces means that all the individual people who identify as Baha'i, Jew, Christian, or Muslim are scattered because there's no essential spiritual unity behind the scenes. And the proof is right in front of us. They're all arguing with each other. It's the same religion. There should be no disagreement between Baha'is, Jews, Christians, and Muslims. In the Baha'i world, we see 6 groups in opposition to the covenant. The mainstream group, when Maria Khanum died, has no connection to the Holy Family. And the other 5 groups that accepted Mason Remy to be Abdul-Baha's son and the first president of the UHJ, they didn't accept Mason Remy's son, Pepe, which is Abdul-Baha's grandson. So all the groups separated themselves from the family. None of the groups claim any connection legally and spiritually to the Holy Family at all in the appointed line of succession. And it's not a pedigree, it's spiritual and legal. This is why the entire Holy Family physiologically, from the days of Bahaullah, abdulbaha, and Shoghi Effendi, fell away, because it doesn't matter what our pedigree is, our physiology. What counts is our soul. Abdul-Baha stated that a true son has branched from the spiritual portion of a man. So all of the Baha'i people, all the men and women in the Baha'i faith are the sons of God, the spiritual children of Bahaullah and Abdul-Baha. One of them is also his legal son for the legal inheritance of the private property of the throne of King David. The Baha'i faith is not communistic. People have the right to private property. And that includes the private property of the throne of David that Bahá'u'lláh inherited from his father, that his father inherited from his father before him. And Baha'u'llah's grandfather sat on the throne of David, his great-grandfather, his father's great-grandfather, all the way back to King David through Solomon on an unbroken line of male sperm descendants of King David that were in exile. Abdul-Baha inherited this personal property, not Muhammad Ali. If Muhammad Ali would not have broken the covenant, he would have inherited that property after the passing of Abdul-Baha. But he wanted that property for some reason for himself immediately. And by doing this, he removed himself from being qualified. And Shoghi Effendi's family fell away. So we were left with Mason Remy, the spiritual and legal son of Abdul-Baha, who inherited the personal property of the throne of King David. Now, there have been a lot of people seated upon the throne of King David. Between King David and today, Baha'u'lláh is the 96th human being to sit upon the throne of David, with Solomon being the first. I'm the 100th person. I'm the 100th descendant of King David to be seated on the throne since Solomon. So this is prophesied of in the 100 blocks. Represent this in the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid of Giza. And it's also described in prophetic imagery in other places. This is private personal property. Now we look at those 100 people, human beings who were seated upon this throne after David, Solomon being the first and me being the 100th. They're not all equal. In the Old Testament, some of these people were completely misguided. And it tells about the destruction that came upon them. After Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem, put Jehoiachin in prison, from that point forward, the successorships on the throne have been pure of heart. But we don't know a lot about all of them. Some of them did certain things and others did greater things, like the Exilarch Bostonai, the founder of the Balandid dynasty, and the Badistanians and the Dabuyids, or those from David that lived in Manzandaran and Takur and Nur and Kujur in that area, that they aren't as well known. But when we look at them, Bahaullah had something in common with the other 100 descendants of David, that he inherited the throne. But compare Bahaullah to his father. His father didn't give a revelation. His grandfather, what did he do? He was the governor and he did great things, but he didn't reveal a whole revelation from God. Abdulbaha received the revelation that Bahaullah gave and delineated it. So, in other words, being seated upon the throne of David doesn't mean that the person's infallible. In fact, they're not infallible at all. The conferred infallibility from this revelation goes from Bahaullah to Abdulbaha to Shoghi Effendi to the Council of the Universal House of Justice, which can only be formed by the chosen successors of the Alim of the rod of iron, who are equal spiritual successors to the branch of wood, the legal successor to the throne of David, together form the body of the Universal House of Justice. And in this way, the community is guided. And all of the individual members of the House of Justice, including the president, have not conferred infallibility. They're not infallible. Now, they might be infallible in their missions. Like if one of them is a doctor, he might be an infallible physician. If another one's a ship's captain, he might be an infallible ship's captain. If another one is a surgeon, she might be an infallible surgeon or an infallible professor at a university. But this is in their spheres and purview of jurisdiction. The reason the Universal House of Justice is free from all error is it has access to all the people of the world. And the people of the world have genius. And if they have a problem at the Universal House of Justice, they can call in these expert people to give the truth of the facts of the situation. And then the members of the House of Justice can vote about this. And the main thing that it functions as is the settlement of disputes. In other words, if we accept a community that has a living guardian in it, there's going to be disputes in the community between our different points of view. And the guardian that we've seen since the House of Justice became the successor to Shoghi Effendi have been able to really stir things up and test the people in many different ways. And the test is whether they're going to use their intellect to go by what's true or just go by blind imitation or something like this. So firmness in the covenant has to do with our personal relationship between us and God and accepting the spiritual reality of Bahaullah and Abdulbaha. Now, after that, Shoghi Effendi states that we're all just equally administrative. And he wore a business suit and a tie, and he didn't reveal prayers, and he didn't give, spiritual, mystical teachings and things like this. These are already in the Baha'i scripture. He said that it was his job to, as the second successor, to establish the administration, which is the eventual framework for the election of the Supreme Tribunal or the Universal House of Justice. But in order for this to happen, it starts as an appointed phase. And he appointed all the members of the first Universal House of Justice and announced its formation on January 9th of 51, welcomed Abdulbaha's son as the president on May 2nd of 1951, and then added more members to it until there were 9 total, but it was appointed. And it never had a meeting. It never took a breath. And when the hands did what they did, it died in embryo and it was aborted and reestablished in the lifetime of Abdulbaha's grandson as the second International Baha'i Council on January 9th, 1991. In other words, it's legal. If you use your intellect and you understand law and legal things like an inheritance, a father is allowed to give his son an inheritance. A mother can give her son or her daughter an inheritance. A person that owns a business can just pick somebody and give all of their wealth to them to inherit or their material wealth at the time of their passing. This is rights of human beings to pass on personal property by law. Mason Remy inherited the throne of King David. Pepe inherited it after him, and today we have the person who inherited that after Pepe, and this will continue. And this creates testing. And the testing creates tensions. And the tensions create what Abdulbaha says is life, growth, the cooperation for survival where we work together. He states that through the contrast of differing points of view or opinions, the spark of truth will be made known. Our faith is so firm in the covenant that each one of the believers has a radically different personal individuality and understanding of current events and societal operations and spiritual and religious concepts and intellectual development and artistic and scientific outlooks. This is unique, where each person becomes so self-actualized through the transcendence of the power of the covenant that they become a real human being, uniquely distinguished from any other human being. The same way no two snowflakes are alike, and no two grains of sand are alike, and no two grains of wheat are alike. In the creation of God, everything has its own unique individuality. There's no repetition. Everything is brand new and unique in its individuality. And we are brand new as individual people who have a birthday here on this plane and have a beginning of our personal individuality. And our personal individuality is the true essence of our spiritual soul. And our soul is outside of the space-time continuum. So although it has newness regarding our individuality, it is ancient, Abdulbaha says, in regards to the connection it has as an emanation from the ancient source. So this is the purpose of the Baha'i faith, is that the people need to come out of the animal spirit and just being tested by animal struggles with each other, to using their intellect to recognize the ones that God has purposed for his day and age for the education and development of the people. The future of the Baha'i faith is that, what I've been describing. And it's been continuing in that direction, and it's going to continue the deepening of people in the inner human reality of the spirit, the deeper and deeper and thicker and richer and higher, greater, whatever words you want that mean more, people become created in the image and likeness of God in their own personal maturation, the more we will create an external physical civilization and society to reflect our inner spiritual qualities and attributes and values. When the 9/11 happened and the trade towers collapsed and the people lived through that catastrophe, the whole world became Baha'i in that hour, in that twinkling of an eye. All the light bulbs of everybody turned on. Now everybody understood the meaning and the threat that we were in. In fact, that very same time after that, they declared September 22nd, the autumnal equinox, to be World Peace Day after the 9/11 happened. So this shows that the people are Baha'is in their value system of the oneness of humanity, the right to independently investigate the truth. I mean, all the people of the world fulfill this criteria. If we use the criteria of the 12 principles as a standard and the oneness of humanity, we see that the majority, if not all the people of the world, accept this and they fulfill this criteria. The problem we're having is, how are we going to live up to the belief? Abdulbaha says a real Baha'i isn't somebody who just says they believe. They're a person who is attracted, converted, and consecrated, who's experiencing the certitude of reality, the certainty of the personal experience of this. And he explains this is greater than faith. Certitude is greater than faith. It's a certainty. They asked Carl Jung, the famous doctor, if he was a believer, and he says, I don't believe, I know. So this is the type of certitude that we're talking about. So we can be certain in our knowledge that bahaullah is he whom God shall make manifest. We're certain in our knowledge that this is the true house of justice because it has the living Davidic king of our generation as the president. Then we have knowledge and certainty of vision, like we see it, like we can see that this is true. We just don't know it's true intellectually. We actually see it in our environment. And then we have the knowledge of reality, which is the experience of it. And Abdulbaha likens this to fire. We can have certainty of knowledge of fire. Then we might see an actual fire. So we have a certainty of seeing it. And then he says, if we're caught on fire, then we have the experience of the burning itself. Or being, consumed in the heat of the fire. So this is the type of certitude of being the tree that's on fire, that's not consumed, that the chosen ones receive. When they choose to become firm in this covenant, they become part of the tree of the covenant. They become part of the tree of life, which is the tree of the covenant, which is the burning bush of the tree that's on fire, that's not yet consumed, and they're on fire with the cause of God. And this experience that they have is irrefutable by logic or words or even other people trying to force them out of it. Once a person realizes that their flame is on and they have this fire of the love of God in them, and their passions are enkindled and energies directed toward the arc of ascent, away from the arc of descent, and they're able to come back and operate in this world in a way to make this world better, nobody can dissuade them from that path that they've experienced and tasted in the certitude of reality for themselves on their way back to God. And when a person's in this condition, they're not looking to take over the government of the material rule of the lands. There's no such thing as an international government. There's no property there. Everything takes place locally. Where the local government is, that's where the territory is actually governed. The regional government coordinates the activities of all the local ones. The regional one, is over like a state, and what's happening is they're not just dictating to the people. The people in all the areas have difficulties and things they need to do to coordinate. So they send representatives to the national or regional one to coordinate the actual implementation of things on the ground. Well, beyond that, the nations and regions need to coordinate. So there is no need for an international army and all of this stuff that people have imagined in their fantasies of empire building. The nations already have national armies. They're able to come together and work internationally to cooperate to get things done. But they're not the members of the international force of an international government. They're the members of the military, of the government, of the state and nation they're from, that are cooperating with the ones of the other nations together. And this is the problem, that no one nation should rule the world. Russia should not conquer the planet and we're all dominated by Russia. The UK should not conquer the planet and we're all governed by London. Alexander the Great doesn't need to conquer the whole planet and we're all governed because of Greece. Napoleon comes and we're all governed by France. The Caesar comes and we're all governed by Rome. The Pax Americana comes and we're all governed by Washington, D.C. No, each nation governs itself and they elect representatives to the number of population that they have to sit on an international tribunal and make sure that there's no reason for wars to develop. And the reasons the wars develop is we have people who are addicted to breaking the covenant of international peace, 1928. They're addicted to their insistent self, and they have schemes and things for greed, self-empowerment, self-aggrandizement that are disrupting spiritual society, which is the cooperation to survive. We're going to be dying if we don't cooperate to survive soon. The pollution from the war machine, the planned obsolescence, the amount of non-recyclable goods and waste products and plastics on the garbage islands in the Pacific Ocean and the other waters, the clothes, the oceans of clothes that people don't use that are down in South America and other places, the amount of pollution that's taking place is so destructive that they say that we have to clean up our act by the year 2050. We won't have a breathable atmosphere. And the bees are dying, and then the plants will die, and the trees will die, and they make oxygen. We're in a global health crisis, environmental crisis, and it goes on. And we have to cooperate now, immediately, to stop the destruction of the environment through the building of these dams and the pollutions and the war machine that's producing this. That's the modus behind empire building that everybody's infected with. You go to these other cities and they're all trying to build skyscrapers taller than the other one. They're competing with each other in the nation state level for empire building, or for the city state level of who has the tallest buildings and stuff like this, while the world's being polluted and consumed and destroyed. And with the environment gone, we won't be here either. They've stated at the UN and the IMF, we have to cooperate now. Now, we have to do it immediately, or we're facing the horrible consequences that we're bringing upon ourselves by not being the caretakers and replenishers of the earth. But because of the war in the Ukraine, we're in the opposite spectrum. We're nowhere near cooperating the way we need to be to do what we should be doing to save the environment of the planet, which is our home. We're supposed to be the gardeners here. The whole planet's the Garden of Eden, if we take care of it as such, and that's our job. In order to do that, we have to cooperate.